first of all, I'd like to say it's a great privilege to be able to talk here today. I'd like to thank Bryce and the whole AIA team for making this possible. It may seem, I think, unusual for a Polish-Australian dialogues on security, but I think these are really unusual times. And today I'll try to build a case for this kind of dialogue, as I think increasingly our security is linked with the Indo-Pacific security. This is the main thing that brings us here, me and Michał, our lead analyst on China. We've been very positively surprised, or maybe not, that wasn't a surprise, that Canberra is very open to this kind of conversations. And I'm happy that today's engagement can be part of that. Where do I start? Maybe the best way to start would be to give you a very brief overview of how we see the situation unfolding in Europe. This might be a very Polish view or Eastern flank view, but this is we are in a very dire situation these days. We're 2.5 years into a full-fledged invasion, a full-scale war happening in Europe, just at NATO's and EU's doorstep, with a country that is aspiring to be part of the European family and be forcefully deprived of this strategic choice. The support for Ukraine is of utmost importance, because this war is a systemic war that will have a long-term effects, not only in Europe, but arguably globally. The point I want to make, and that brings me to the present situation in Europe, is that for Russia, this war is not merely about Ukraine or a piece of Ukrainian land. And the Russian lead has been openly saying that this is a systemic war, and their main goal is to transform European security, to rewrite the rules, and set up new ones that will give Russia a say over what's happening not only in the post-Soviet space, but also whole Central Europe and beyond. I think if you want to have a very comprehensive overview of what are Russia's goals, and these have not changed throughout the conflict, it's best to reach out to the letters the Russians, the Kremlin, have sent to Europe, to NATO and the US, and the ultimatum they've sent and dispatched. And they said a total subjugation of Ukraine, but also withdrawal of NATO forces to pre-1997 borders, which essentially means turning the whole Central European or Northeastern European region into a buffer zone when Russia has a say over what's happening. And essentially, these goals have not changed, despite a great strategic blunder that Putin has made. This creates a situation in which the conflict will unfortunately not be resolved as long as the current regime is in place in Russia. Unfortunately, it's firmly stable, and unfortunately being propped up by other countries, including China. And this brings me to the very topic of today's talk. I'll be happy to respond to your questions later on the China-Russia relationship and the effects it has on both our security and arguably the Indo-Pacific security too. So let me start with the fundaments. What's actually in between Russia and China? I think that we ourselves describe as an alliance in all but name. We all know that the Chinese are reluctant to have formal alliances signed. This is not part of the strategic culture of China. There are reasons for Russia not to sign it too, but in the words of the Russian diplomats themselves and Lavrov, he's saying that this relationship is actually much more than a traditional Western alliances. And the level of coordination is much deeper. I think there's some truth in it. In terms of the fundamental things that glues them together these days, I think firstly is this very evident strategic synergy between what the Russians and Chinese undertake in Europe and in the Pacific. which is essentially a dismantling of the US-led alliance systems and dismantling of the current security systems in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The synergy, I think, is very obvious to them. They've been, I think, preparing for coordination on this for a long time. I don't want to dig too deep into the historical background of this relationship, but they've been building this relationship of 30 years now. It's not something that has emerged 2 years ago. And I think both the Russian and Chinese elites have made a decision to draw lessons from the Cold War when they were at odds with each other, and the US won because it enabled it was able to drive a wedge between the two. And so they've decided to build the relationship, which has become very comprehensive and multifaceted, to solve the border disputes. That's actually one of the first decisions Putin made after ascending to power in 2000, was to solve the territorial dispute with China. They've been then working both on the global stage, regional groupings, and bilaterally. But as the years went by, and especially in mid 2010s, 2014, 15, 16, I think both sides finally decided that their conflict with the US and the West is inevitable. I think for the Russians it was somewhere between 2011 and 14. First with the wide-scale protests in Moscow that made Russians think that the US wants to overthrow the regime. And then 2014 and annexation of Crimea. The time frame for China was quite different, of course, but Trump's ascendance to power and what happened after that within the US strategic establishment convinced the Chinese that the US wants basically to destroy China. I think this is what they believe. And that's where the interests of the two elites finally converged. And the No Limits partnership that was announced on just the eve of the Russian invasion laid out this pretty openly. I think the first indications of them going public with this synergy, whether in I think November or December 2021, that's when the Chinese started to pitch the idea of Russia's legitimate security interest in Europe. But the February 4th declaration of 2022 made it very open that what they're after is actually to use this synergy for China, for Russia and for China to acknowledge Russia's goals in Europe, dismantling the current security order, and for Russia to endorse China's agenda vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis AUKUS, Quad, and the whole alliance system that you build here. And I think the best depiction of the strategic synergy is the one that I heard from one of the Chinese analysts of two boxers fighting back to back. I think it's a really powerful metaphor that might not be necessarily the same fight. But not in the same place at least. But what the relationship gives them is the kind of a belief that the other side will hold their back and they can focus on the respective theaters. One additional layer of this fundamental convergence is on the level of ideology. Of course, in terms of contents, the CCP internal ideology is very different from the Russian one. I don't need to explain why. The Russians are arguably the defenders of traditional values, and China is, of course, bringing the shared community, the community of shared destiny, how we call it. The contents are different, but I think the underlying fundament is the same. They want to protect their authoritarian regimes, and they want to protect their satellite states, authoritarian regimes, be it in Belarus or in North Korea or in Kazakhstan. And I think one thing they can be sure of, both Beijing and Moscow, is that the other side will not try to overthrow their regime, which means a lot. This kind of a ideological non-aggression pact is meaningful because both CCP and the Russian elite believe that what democracy is ultimately about is for the CIA to overthrow them through a colorful revolution. And that's the lens through which they look at all kinds of developments, be it the protests in Belarus, Hong Kong, and beyond. So those are the two major fundaments: the strategic synergy and then ideological convergence that I think are very sound and very robust. There are people saying that it's, of course, all revolving around the US as the arch enemy for both. And it's merely an alliance of convenience, a marriage of convenience, of however you call it. And if the US is out of the equation, they will go after each other, which might very well be true. But I think the process of the US going away will be very turbulent. And I think from the point of view of frontline states, as we see it in Poland, but arguably also for countries like Australia or Japan or South Korea, the process of the US going away is a very dark scenario. So I think for the time being and for foreseeable future, this US-centered alliance is, I think, a pretty robust. So let me kind of disaggregate this relationship into the Kremlin logic and the Chinese logic as we see it. I'm happy to be part of an organization that covers both. And on Russia, I'll just refer to the understanding that our colleagues working on Russia got. So essentially, the thing that the Russian approach is based on is essentially that a Chinese-centric order is a lesser evil to what the US stands for and the democracy stands for. It's not ideal. It's based on a mixed historical legacy. There's always been this younger brother and older brother competition between Stalin, Mao Zedong, and then Khrushchev and Mao, and so on. It was very turbulent, but the Russians, after they've lost the Cold War, they came to a conclusion that they will be actually a younger brother in this relationship. They will be a weaker one. But first of all, they want to be indispensable for China. They want to be so needed that China will never dare to infringe on their interests. And also the assumption was that I'm sorry for that. This metaphor I'll use is based on Russian gender terms, which might be offensive, but this is the metaphor they use. So they say they don't want to be a younger brother, but rather an older sister, which in a Russian gender terms mean they'll be weaker, but much more experienced when facing the West. They will kind of guide China through the process as the one that's much more experienced, audacious, and willing and able to assist China here. All of that while maintaining maximum autonomy within the relationship. That means keeping China at bay in terms of Russia's economy. They will always caring to be as independent as possible. Also using the assets Russia has, the nuclear arsenal, and also what Russia thought would be their most ultimate asset would be a reformed and skilled military able to wage wars and win wars. And this is the thing that didn't work out, as we all know. So that's the primary reason why Russia is now becoming even weaker within this relationship. Yet it still sticks to it. As I said, the only viable alternative would be to once again reach out to the West, which is not an option for them. When it comes to China and their calculus here, I would say, basing on our conversations with our long-term interlocutors, we had a privilege to, privilege. That was certainly a thing that works for us. We had a long-term conversation with the Chinese on Russia. As it happens, Russia is the only common neighbor Poland and China has. And China has been always interested in how we see Russia, and still is, I would say. And what the things they're saying now is that given how bad things are between the US and China, and the conflict's not going to go away anytime soon, what they essentially say is first, if Russia loses now, then the whole US-led alliance system will go after China. So that's the basic assumption. And so they just cannot afford it. It doesn't mean that they love Russians, that it doesn't mean that they trust them, but the sole fact of Russia being the only viable partner in countering the US is making them support Russians on a fundamental basis. And this is how the situation unraveled after the Russian invasion. It brought a lot of cost to the Chinese, including diplomatic cost with relations with Europe and the West and beyond. Yet they still decided to double down on this relationship. And this is, in fact, what we've seen. There was a lot of debate on what will China do after the February 24th. Lots of speculation. Well, is it a good time for China to say, maybe we were wrong? We made a bet on a vicious leader that waged war in Europe. We don't want to have anything to do with him. But they didn't do it. And everybody was waiting for the CCP Congress 2021 autumn. I mean, just a bit of history. We've been waiting for this moment to find out after Xi Jinping has reestablished himself as the leader for the third term, what will he do? And the first thing the CCP did when Wang Yi joined the Politburo, he picked up the phone, called Lavrov, and said, only under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, China and Russia can make the great change in the international scene. That was the moment I think they calculated that. However, I mean, Russia might be a liability, but it's still a very powerful asset that can be used to bleed the West out, to distract the US. And the value added coming from the conflict being prolonged is considerable. I would say that in the long term, they also support the strategic goals that Russians have. I mean, they saying this openly that coming to Poland, they're saying that the security system you've built in Europe, pointing at us Europeans and beyond, the security system you've built was flawed. It resulted in war, and the war is your fault. And you need a new security system that will acknowledge Russia's interests. Of course, this is the strategic level. And I think that our main takeaway so far is that it's not possible to change China's strategic calculus vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, there's just no way to do this because of this, outlook they have on the competition with the US, which is, I think they don't believe it's possible to avoid it. And as long as the US threat is there, they will need to lean towards the Russians. That's the strategic level. I don't think that the calculus can be changed on the strategic level. What happens occasionally are tactical mismatches. Russia is at war with the West already. It's in Russia's interest to escalate it, to make things worse, including here in the Indo-Pacific, because the worse the situation is between China and the US, China and the Indo-Pacific, the more valuable Putin becomes. Not only as a destructor, but also as a source of raw resources. So if there's a conflict in the Pacific, and say Australia is not able to sell resources to China, then Russia becomes the only supplier of coal and gas and rare earths and you name it. So it's in their interest to escalate things. That's one thing you could look at Putin visiting North Korea lately and signing the deal. We'll find out how coordinated this thing was with the Chinese. But if Kim feel feels encouraged, and if he escalated now, I think that would be one example of Russia actually trying to play this arsonist role, not only in Europe, but also here. There are things linked with the nuclear weapons and Russia's nuclear blackmail. There's been a lot of dialogue between China and the West on actually putting some limits on Putin. I think it's in China's interest to block him here. First of all, because if tactical nukes are being used in Ukraine and the taboo is broken, I think it will be the Chinese who will bear the burden of the proliferation, because it will not be in Africa or Latin America when the next use of a bomb will happen. It will be somewhere around China. It will be the Japan and South Korea immediately starting to think about possessing it. It will be, I know about Taiwan. They had their attempts in 1970s, but Iran, India, Pakistan, the use of nuclear weapons will certainly make the environment deteriorate. There's also a very interesting argument that China might want to maintain this trump card of nuclear escalation from themselves. So why would they allow the Russians to do that? There's issues about Central Asia where there was a time in early 2022 when the Russian aggressive imperialism started to spill over to Kazakhstan, when the Russian propaganda started to talk about the Russian minority in Kazakhstan. The Russians started to cut all exports that transit through Russia. That was a moment when Xi Jinping went to Kazakhstan, gave Tokayev a pat in the back and said, "We endorse your way." And it was a clear signal to the Russians, like, you better get back in line. You were meant to stabilize the region and not destabilize it. So let's make things as they were. So there are these tensions happening between them. But the point is that I don't think they give a serious dent to the strategic relationship they have. And they have a long history of actually ironing things out. And there's been Russia has been, suspicious of the BRI. In 2013, they were really agitated with what China has pitched, and it took them like 2 or 3 years to actually kind of start to work together, and now they're very much in line. So the thing is that I don't think you can peel China off from Russia. The only thing we can do is to repeat the mistakes we did with the Russians. 5 or 10 years ago, we tried to pull Russia out from China by giving them concessions. And what Russians did, they took it all. And at the end of the day, they just invaded Europe. I think that could be very easily replicated with the Chinese. It's very unfortunate, but I think that's the reality that we'll have to somehow learn how to deal with this, uneven and sometimes conflicted but very firm Chinese-Russian compound. And this is what brings me to the last segment here on what do we do. I think this is the ultimate platform through which our security and your security are becoming increasingly intertwined. I think in the near future, I mean, the thing we are very much concerned with in Poland and in Europe in general is an escalation here in the Indo-Pacific. Because if there's a conflict of medium or large scale, this will immediately create a window of opportunity for Russia to escalate in Europe. The US will be distracted. The EU will be in economic turmoil. And the Russians, the only thing that keeps Russians at bay is our deterrence, because they're openly saying they're at war with us, and they're openly preparing for a war with NATO. So once the deterrence gets weaker, they will try to escalate. That's why for us, deterrence here is increasing deterrence in Europe too. But there are also things going below the threshold of conflicts where the China-Russia axis also has an impact on us. On our European side, China is actively trying to, undermine the resolve of Europe, undermine the support for Ukraine. The latest Switzerland peace summit organized by Kiev was not only not attended by the Chinese, but we have an evidence of China actually traveling out the global south, telling countries not to go there. And this is what Kiev is openly talking about now. There's been a lot of disinformation propaganda, China disseminating this in Europe, saying that, the US is a warmonger, it's all NATO's fault, and we all want to bleed Ukraine out, which is just, playing on those more pro-Russian elements in Europe. Just to mention the last Xi Jinping's visit, France, Hungary, and Serbia, what China considers as the most fragile parts of the European system. For Orban and Vucic in Serbia, I think it's quite obvious. By the way, Xi Jinping visited Belgrade in Serbia on the 25th anniversary to the day of the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy, which is that was accidental, but he managed to use this opportunity. On France, I think it's a long-term attempt to play on this anti-American French sentiment, once again to weaken the integrity of the European side of the alliance system. And I would say Russia reciprocates in kind. I mean, they also doing things that are helpful for the Chinese. They're spreading disinformation in Southeast Asia. They're reaching out to those more fragile parts of this alliance system here. Putin just been to Vietnam. He's engaging India to pull the Indians away from the things you guys are trying to build there. So I would say the diplomatic exchange of favors on both sides is one thing that is happening now. Disinformation, which I think is increasingly coordinated. We see not only China learning from Russia, but sometimes giving Russians the network, the disinformation network and propaganda network to actually plant some ideas in Europe. And New Caledonia happening now with the strong Russian trace, certainly in China's interest. The Solomon Islands disinformation during the elections, I think that's alive and kicking. And even below the conflict threshold, there's a lot that they will be able to do that is harmful for us. So I think the main point I want to make is they are already actively coordinating against us, and they're acting together against us on both theaters. So I would say it's high time for us to actually have this conversation on how to counteract this. And I think for countries that are most affected are the countries who are the frontline states. In Europe, that's the northeastern flank. It used to be the eastern flank, but now we have Finland and Sweden in. I think you will get a very similar threat perception throughout this region. That's put on alert when it comes to the role that China plays in there. But on the other side of Eurasia, we have the AP4, how we call it in NATO, which is Australia, South Korea, Japan, but also other countries that are at least partially taking part in it, like Singapore, which joined the sanctions and was very active there. Hopefully, a bigger group of countries that feel threatened by what's happening. And I think this conversation is really something we should start to engage on, and both in terms of a joint understanding of what's the dynamics on the international system. You already got my interpretation and our interpretation, but preparing for contingencies. And I think there's a growing chance that the next big crisis will be actively coordinated between Russia and China. Sometimes it's opportunistic, but I would say there's a growing chance they might actually synchronize the escalatory measures on both sides, and we need to be ready, tracking on both sides what's happening. We need to be ready to actually also be able to coordinate. And then again, there's a lot of deterritorialized threats that are not bound by geography, like cyber attacks, like disinformation, which are already making life much harder for us from both sides. So what I can end with is just a call to make it more operationalized and hopefully, enhancing the security on both sides here. Thank you very much.
Okay, please stay there, Jakub. Right, for those of you at home, we've already got some questions coming through, and I'll ask one soon. For those of you here, please just put up your hand when we come to you with the microphone. We will, could you please just identify yourself by name and any affiliation you might have. Jakub, we do have a question online as to whether it's from Christopher Skinner, who is a member of our ACT branch, our New South Wales branch, and he's asking about technological capabilities. Are there any technological capabilities that Russia in particular desires to share with China, wants China to give up to them, and if so, what, and what way is there technological cooperation between the two?
Oh, well, thanks. It's a very good question. Of course, what concerns, in terms of technology flows from Russia to China, certainly defense technologies were the most important for many years. And that was one of the elements of the Russia's strategy to reduce the asymmetry between the two. They used to have an upper hand on various military systems. But as the time went by, you could really see China sometimes on their own and sometimes just by stealing Russian tech, being increasingly independent in building this. And at this moment, I think the most crucial thing that Russians have and Chinese still don't are the jet engines. That's actually one of the main export products apart from unprocessed resources that Russia still sends to China. There was an interesting, Ukrainian trace there. There was a company called Motor Sich in Zaporizhia in Ukraine, which also possessed this particular tech. China was really interested in getting that. They were almost there. They bought a stake in this company. They started to transfer Ukrainian engineers to Chongqing. But then when that's where the U.S. stepped in, and you had the advisor, the National Security Advisor Bolton, going to Kiev, stopping this. So that was the last Chinese attempt to kind of circumvent Russians there. And but at this point, I would say this is the main conventional technology that China is still interested in. But then there's the whole issue of China's strategic nuclear force buildup. China wants to be on par with the Russians and the US in 2030s. And this is, I think, a place where Russia still has a lot to offer in terms of doctrine, in terms of military capability, in terms of plutonium. And I would guess this will be something that China will be pressuring them to offer, having an upper hand. Yeah.
Dr. Elena Zabortseva, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just proceed. Yeah.
Dr. Elena Zabortseva, I work in public service, but I'm also affiliated to the NU, and I will ask this question from the NU. I'm also the author of the book Russia's Relations with Kazakhstan. So
okay.
I have that question. Thank you very much for addressing these important and challenging issues. It's remarkable that we've had discussions and we'll find a solution collectively at one popular stage. My first question is, you've said that Russia lost the Cold War. So if you look at it from realist perspective, you don't think that there were movements from Russia itself to look at it differently. That Gorbachev was trying to establish a new type of relationships, and that he and some of his supporters were looking at it from a liberal perspective. And second question, when you've said Russia's position in relation to invasion, did you mean Russian, can I clarify, did you mean Russian Kremlin's government position, or do you include broader circles of elites or even population? But when you spoke about Russia-Chinese relationships, you said that it is supported by elites, assuming financial support, not security interest in terms of collective security treaty organization or Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I mean, on Russia losing the Cold War, I think that's the assessment of the Putin's elite now, that there were things that Gorbachev did wrong, and also, as a matter of fact, that Lenin did wrong. If you heard the Putin speech just on the eve of the invasion, I think the current elite is very revisionist on what happened and the choices the Russia made. And of course, it is not the full picture, but unfortunately, these are the people who are in power now. And the legacy of the other Russia actually meaningfully wanting to engage the West to find a common solution. I think the chance was there, but it's unfortunately lost with this elite not willing to do this. And on the Russian elite, I mean, it's a large quantifier. I mean, it's a very broad term. I think on the relationship with China, there is some internal tension. I think it's the bet that Russia made, I was talking about, was the bet Putin made and his immediate circle made. But certainly there are people within the system that are suspicious and they're cautious and actually probably criticizing Putin from within because of the dependency he got into and the whole Russian state along with him. And I think you can really see that in a way that Putin is really finding very creative ways to explain to the Russians and the elite of why actually he had to do this. I just recall this interview he gave in the Russian television, I think 2 or 3 months ago. He was asked about his dependency, the President Putin. How do you feel about that? And is it a good thing? And he brought about a historical metaphor, of course, because it's Putin. And he said about Alexander Nevsky, it's like medieval story of a Muscovy leader willingly subjugate to the Golden Horde, the Mongols, and that Putin said we are in a similar position and it was wise of Alexander Nevsky to allow for this subjugation because he defended Russia from vicious West and the Crusaders. So I think the fact that he needs to make up those stories reflects a kind of a pressure from within of people actually not really being happy about that. I mean, after all, they wanted to maintain this as much autonomy as possible for a long time, and it's disintegrating. It's Russia's really becoming very, 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 very dependent on China. There's a big question mark on how exactly this dependence can be put into actual influence, turned into actual influence. I think still China has little experience in managing the Russian political system. So the leverage is there in theory, but it was not put into practice. And I think there despite this dependence, I think there are many things Russia tries to do to still show to the Chinese that they are not calling the shots in Kremlin, in Moscow. Just to give you one example, when Xi Jinping went to Moscow last year, he signed a document with the Russians on both sides jointly opposing deployment of nuclear weapons to third countries. And 3 days after Xi Jinping left Moscow, Putin announced he's deploying nuclear weapons in Belarus, which I think is a way of him showing to the Chinese and also to the broader elite, that he still has some agency within this relationship. And this gives you also the limitations of the no limits partnership. I think the limitations are there.
Okay, fantastic. The microphone is actually working, so please do just speak into it. We're going to Andreas Radka now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andreas Radka. I'm working with a German political foundation that's linked to the German Labour Party. Thank you very much for the very enlightening talk. I think you're very spot on in highlighting the calculations behind that no limits partnership, and that there's really no lack of cynicism in the calculations of how this relationship works. And how both sides are trying to make the most out of that. Still, the players are very different, and you alluded yourself to a marriage of convenience. You could also look at it in terms of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I might just ask you to maybe look a little bit further at those differences. And I mean, the thing that strikes me most certainly is that I find it very hard to see in the Russian thrust in all this, in the Russian policies, any constructive elements, right? It is a very revisionist policies that are based in nostalgia, in the bitterness over having lost the empire and the Cold War. And I mean, obviously, the Chinese system also is very much focused on regime stability and so on. But the context in which they have to look at that is a lot more complex. And one key element there is, of course, the way China is linked economically to the world, and the way the Chinese regime depends on really making the most out of those global relationships to continue growing prosperity at home, which is really a key element for regime stability. And that makes for a really big difference. And I am wondering, you're, I think, rightfully saying it's very hard to dislodge that relationship, but the Chinese have a lot to lose in terms of being dragged into an abyss that the Russians are opening with their revisionist policies. And I'd be interested to hear how you view that.
Well, I think the contradiction is really there. I think it's not my copyright. I think I heard it in Sydney, but it's a really nice framing of Russia being an arsonist and China being a builder of a very alternative international order, but still kind of a builder. Then comes the issue of internal stability and economic prosperity. But I mean, of course, we tend to think a lot about that, this discrepancy. I don't think that's the only discrepancy. I just want to highlight one more, is the discrepancy in terms of time frame. You know, Russia wants the world to set the world on fire now, because it's already in an existential war with the West, as it sees. For China, at least they will love to have at least a decade to prepare itself for the conflict. You know, and that's, I think, one of the explanations why the Chinese did not escalate in coordinations with the Russians. It will not be Putin that will set the time frame for the World War. I mean, China will wage one only after it decides it wants it, you know, it not be Putin deciding on that. But in terms of internal stability, I mean, I think the way we look at it is through the lens of what's happening inside China. And I think the stability is no longer there. And it's not because of Russia or war in Ukraine or anything else. It's just the fundaments of China's prosperity are not there, and they're looking for new ones. I think that's where I mean, it's not a new idea that the China's growth is unbalanced, unsustainable, and therefore, you know, it was Yuan Jiabao in 2007. I think Xi Jinping is very much aware that what the main fuel that the CCP got in terms of legitimacy is no longer there. And I think that's why he's making so much effort to securitize the economy, to stabilize it, to grab it in a much tighter grip. Also, having in mind that, once again, I think the Chinese are convinced that the America wants to destroy them. I don't think that's true. I mean, looking at the conversations in the US, you have some people arguing for that, but you have so many more that actually want to keep things relatively stable. But I think for the Chinese, they're in this mindset, at least I think, the leadership. So then comes the issue. I mean, how much of an impact the war in Ukraine has on Chinese stability vis-a-vis those other two big macro trends, internal problems and US pressure. I think it's relatively small. I mean, the war in Ukraine. That's why I don't think they care that much, to be honest. Probably they would care if the war spilled over to whole Europe. I mean, hopefully that's their calculus. I mean, from a Polish point of view, I wish they really wanted to avoid this. Unfortunately for Ukraine, I don't see that they treat it as such. I mean, their economic problems did not result from the war going on. There was a problem with the international grain market for a while, but that's it. But I just don't want to downplay those discrepancies. I think there's a different system, and I don't think as the West we can actually unbundle them by offering off-ramps, but playing on those discrepancies might be one way to do this. For us, it's like talking to the Chinese, just highlighting this, that Putin actually wants you to have a war with the US as soon as possible. This is his policy. And if he had the means to do that, he would do that. So you better kind of, pardon my French, but the message we want to deliver to them is that you have a rabid dog on a leash, so you better be careful.
Right. I'm just going to quickly go to an online question. It's kind of not really within the context of China-Russia, and it's kind of asking the question that we were talking about before the session on the likelihood of a conflict over Taiwan. What do you as a China expert think about that? But I wonder if you can expand that and talk about the context of Taiwan within Russia-China relations.
Well, that's a big question. I think the way we think about that is that I mean, this 2027 CIA messaging on Xi Jinping asking the army to be ready is just to have a capability. It doesn't mean he has an intention to do this. Yeah. So I think that the risk is on the rise. It's fairly small now, but the way, I mean, it's not only about the army, it's about the food autonomy, energy autonomy, all kinds of autonomies, insulating the society from the outside. He's actively preparing for a period of, for tensions and potentially conflict. Whether or not the China will decide that that the war is inevitable is contingent on several factors. I mean, I think they still believe that Taiwan might fall into their lap one time or another, that they can use the political solution to that to coerce the West, coerce Taiwan, wait for the US to have internal troubles. I think they're also betting on that. I think the way that both Russia and China look at us democracies is that they see turmoil everywhere. They see crisis everywhere. They see populism, instability, migration, economic problems, and they're just waiting for us to disintegrate on our own, which I think is the kind of a cognitive mistake every autocracy will do, just like we do it in reverse. We look at us and it's all mess. We look at them and it's rock solid. But the point is that that's how every authoritarian regime looks like until it falls apart. So it's I just wouldn't want to fall into this trap. But on Taiwan, I would say the risk is on the rise and it's serious. And once again, from our point of view, it's extremely serious too. I mean, because if there was an invasion resulting in a domino effect within the region, and I think there are many increasing number of countries that are saying that they will be involved, they will have to be involved. This will, bounce back to Europe on day one or day two. It's not about us not getting semiconductors. That will be a tertiary problem for us, I would say. First, that will be an economic crisis. Secondly, Russia starting escalation. Thirdly, big debate on sanctioning China, and every country being economically dependent on China will start to have this major debate, and including, I think, applies for both Europe and Australia, as I see it. And then at some moment we'll be deprived of semiconductors, but that'll be rough 3 months before we run out of our stock. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. The person with the microphone down the back. Gosh, we've got a lot of questions. We might run over time by about 5 minutes or so, but yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. My name's Joy. I work at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but my question's in a personal capacity. Firstly, I'm interested in your views on the assessment that NATO has pushed China and Russia closer together. And I'm also interested in your take on how ongoing border tensions might undermine the ongoing alliance.
The NATO issue is it's a very good question. I mean, I think, I mean, we had the 25th anniversary of Poland joining NATO this year, and we had this discussion with one of our colleagues in our center. Is the very first official coming from the Eastern Bloc to join NATO, so he's a real veteran, and he's been through all negotiations and NATO and so on. And it's so funny to look at the arguments Russians and Chinese make, because to be frank, NATO expansion was not something any of the established NATO countries wanted at the time. In fact, the US also opposed us joining NATO at the time. It was a really tough uphill battle to get in, for us, for the Baltic states, for Central Europe, an extreme effort to convince countries one by one that we want actually to do this. And the point is that the narratives that Chinese and Russians spread deprive us of any agency there. And I think that this agency was crucial there. So, I mean, there's no merit in this argument, I would say. Also with the NATO expansion to Ukraine, I mean, to be frank, I mean, nobody wanted Ukraine to join NATO, maybe apart from Lithuania and Poland. And they still didn't want Ukraine to join NATO. So it's a completely false argument, Even Ukraine was not convinced at the time that they want to join NATO. There were very differing ideas inside Ukraine. So I think it's reflective of their conspiratorial thinking. I think both China and Russia are convinced it is us crushing them and not them trying to attack us. But I mean, we won't cure them of this conspiratorial thinking. I mean, it's maybe sometimes it'd be unwise to kind of provide them with additional, talking points, especially with regards to the countries in the global south. That's where it's tricky, and I think it should be very smart to diffuse this kind of thing. But yeah, it's flawed. And on the border issue, I think yes, the Chinese map with Chinese names published by the MOD had Vladivostok as Waishenwai, as all other countries had the issues with that. Russia was the only one who did not criticize China on that, and I think it's like rather China poking Russians. It's a kind of a long-term game they play against each other. But I don't think at this point the revision of borders with Russia is high on the Chinese agenda. I think it's on the very at the very end. There are many other border issues they would like to push first, because I think it's totally unwise. It's absurd actually for them to lose the only viable partner or instrument, however you call it, to confront the US for the sake of what? I mean, what's the actual potential to mobilize the Chinese nationalists if you compare it reclaiming Taiwan and reclaiming Vladivostok? I think it's still incomparable. So I don't think, and on the resources in Siberia, I mean, they get it all, 50% discount, as much as they want, timber, natural gas, oil. It's actually Russians pushing China to buy more, to build more pipelines, to build more railways, to get all of those resources out of Russia. So I don't think any revision of borders is needed for China these days. So that would be my answer. But I think China might be keeping these options, but for the very far future. But no, yeah, thanks.
Okay, I'll take two more. There's first here, and then we'll go to
John Killing, Jakub. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm restraining my memory. I think it was only barely 2 years after the fall of the Soviet Union that the process of clawing it back began in Moldova.
Transnistria, yeah.
Given that very strong signal, how do you explain the apparent laxness and naivety of American policy and Western European policy?
Certainly, I think we think a lot of in Poland. Why the strategic blindness? I think, Transnistria and then Chechnya, but then a series of different wars that Russians wage. I think the real wake-up call was 2008 Georgia, then 2014 Ukraine and others. I think we've been kind of, ringing the bells all the time, saying the time will come, all the interdependency economically they're building will work against you. You're building another pipeline. The Russians will use it to coerce you. Then they will attack you. And we were the crazy Russophobic Poles that know nothing about international politics. But I mean, a joy from saying "I told you so" does not compensate from the actual losses we incur now. So we just don't do it. We just say it's not going to stop. It didn't stop in Georgia. It didn't stop in Ukraine 2014. It won't stop in Ukraine 2022 until there's serious, credible response to that. And because unfortunately, I think there's a kind of the primary source is that we want to have a compromise with them to solve this issue, because that's how we do it. Yeah. But the problem is in the Russian strategic culture, once you send out, an offer to negotiate, that means you're weak. And if you're weak, that's the best moment to go further, And that's very unfortunate. I mean, if you asked me, I would really love to solve this problem and live a prosperous rest of my life in Poland. But unfortunately, the only way we can solve it is actually, show to the Russians that are extremely credible and determined to stop them. And they just won't be able to get away with anything else. And this is a kind of a logic we try to spread throughout the whole alliance system. It's not for, prolonging the war. It's essentially, civis pacem parabellum, if you want peace, brace for war. That's the only language the Russians understand, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you, Jakub, for this presentation. Yetmira from the Kosovo Embassy. You mentioned earlier the China's influence, and that was shown with a visit of the president of China recently in some of the countries, European continent, in Europe. Can you show us your perspective on direct Russian influence to Western Balkans? Do you think that there is a direct influence in Western Balkans from Russia, and how it is exercised? Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, there are diverse players meddling in the affairs now. There are the Russians, there are the Chinese, there's Orban, which is very active, especially in Bosnia these days. I think there were cases when the Russian influence was very, overt, very visible, like in Montenegro, the coup attempt and so on. I wouldn't kind of overestimate their influence over Serbia. I think Vučić is really, using external players for his own gain, and it's I think the key here is it's actually Russians being used by him and the Chinese being used by him rather than the other way around. So that will be my short answer. There's certainly the Russians are certainly there, but I don't think they're really controlling the situation. Anything that will make Europe more unstable and susceptible to migratory flows or conflicts is generally good for Russia. But the sole fact that Serbia actually, how much was that? 800 million worth of ammunition delivered to Ukraine, produced in Serbia, really gives you an idea of how relaxed Vučić is when it comes to the Russians. Yeah.
Okay, that's it for. Make sure the people at home can hear. Right, that's it for our talk today, and thanks so much for coming to the AIIA. If you're new here, we do hold events all the time, and the next one, hosted by my office, will be on the UK election. Britain votes on the 3rd of July, the day before the election. So please don't miss out for that. In the meantime, join me to thank our very good speaker. I know there were a lot of questions and we could have gone on for a lot more time. Hopefully you'll stick around for a few more minutes so you can talk to people face to face.
Yeah, sure, of course. I'd like to thank you all for your patience and very insightful questions.
So join me in thanking Jakub Jakóbowski.